My father left a voicemail canceling our sacred family Thanksgiving dinner and threatening legal action because I refused to hand over $50,000 to fund his white son-in-law's failing tech startup. I did not argue. I did not cry. I simply texted the word understood. Then I logged into my banking portal and quietly removed my name as the primary guarantor of my father's $450,000 mortgage. 24 hours later, I woke up to 89 missed calls and his ruthless corporate lawyer leaving me a frantic voicemail begging for mercy. My name is Maya. I am 35 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I was nothing more than the family emergency fund. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who demanded your loyalty while disrespecting your boundaries. Trust me, you will want to hear exactly how I dismantled decades of disrespect with a single click of a mouse. I was sitting on the velvet sofa in my downtown Atlanta condo, watching the city lights flicker against the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a quiet Tuesday evening just 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. I had just poured myself a glass of Cabernet after a grueling 12-hour shift. I work as a senior financial compliance officer for a major corporate firm. My job requires me to spot fraud, mitigate financial risk, and dismantle bad investments before they ruin entire portfolios. Irony has a funny way of weaving itself into your personal life, because my family was the most toxic investment I had ever made. The silence of my living room was shattered when my answering machine clicked on. The booming, authoritative voice of my father, Reginald, filled the space. He did not say hello. He did not ask how my day was. His tone was dripping with that familiar, heavy condescension he usually reserved for his subordinates at the regional logistics company he managed. He spoke slowly, making sure every single word felt like a physical blow. "Maya," he said, his voice echoing in my quiet apartment. "Your mother Vivian and I have decided that your presence at Thanksgiving dinner this year will not be necessary. In fact, you are officially uninvited. You have shown a complete lack of support for this family by refusing to invest in Trent's new business venture. It is completely selfish of you to hoard your wealth while your sister struggles to build her future. Expect a call from my lawyer by the end of the week. I am having him draw up the paperwork to legally sever you from the family trust. Do not bother coming to the house." The machine clicked off. The red light blinked in the dark. For a long moment there was nothing but the sound of city traffic humming 14 stories below. 5 years ago, a message like that would have completely broken me. I would have dissolved into tears, hyperventilating and begging for forgiveness. I would have transferred the $50,000 from my hard-earned savings account to Trent the very next morning just to buy back my seat at the Thanksgiving table. But at 35 years old, I was entirely out of tears. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine and let the rich, dark liquid coat my throat. I thought about Trent, my sister Chloe's husband. Trent was a smooth-talking white guy with a degree in marketing and absolutely zero actual business sense. Yet my father worshipped the ground he walked on. To Reginald, Trent was the son he never had, the visionary entrepreneur who was just one big break away from changing the world and elevating the family name. It did not seem to matter to anyone that Trent's last 3 tech startups had crashed and burned, leaving a massive trail of maxed-out credit cards and angry private investors. Chloe, my younger sister, was the undisputed golden child of the family. She had the perfect hair, the perfect smile, and the perfect ability to manipulate my parents into giving her whatever she wanted whenever she wanted it. While I was pulling consecutive all-nighters in college to maintain my academic scholarship, Chloe was maxing out my father's credit cards on designer handbags and luxury vacations to the Bahamas. My mother Vivian always made excuses for her. She would look at me and say, "Chloe is just finding herself, Maya. You need to be more understanding of her creative spirit." Understanding apparently meant funding their extravagant lifestyle without ever asking questions. Over the past decade, I had paid for Chloe's lavish destination wedding because my parents had overextended themselves. I had bailed Trent out of a bad luxury car lease when his second company went under. I had quietly slipped my mother thousands of dollars to cover the property taxes they somehow forgot to pay year after year. But $50,000 for a non-existent tech app that Trent could not even explain to me in a basic structured business plan was where I firmly drew the line. When I told my father no earlier that week in his study, he had looked at me as if I had spat in his face. He called me a bitter single workaholic who deeply resented her younger sister's happiness. Now he was using Thanksgiving as a weapon to punish me. In our culture, Thanksgiving is not just a holiday, it is an institution. It is the day we honor our ancestors, gather at Big Mama's sprawling historic brick house, and celebrate the generational survival of our family. Being uninvited was the ultimate excommunication. I set my wine glass down on the thick glass coffee table. I picked up my phone. I did not write a long emotional paragraph defending my actions. I did not ask for a family meeting to hash things out. I opened my messages, typed one single word, and hit send. Understood. I tossed the phone onto the cushion beside me and walked over to my home office. I opened my laptop and the bright blue light illuminated my face in the darkened room. I logged into my highly secure banking portal, navigating effortlessly through the complex layers of authentications and passwords. My father Reginald was a fiercely proud man who cared deeply about appearances and social standing in the community. He loved hosting extravagant parties at the estate my grandmother Big Mama had left behind, acting as though he were the king of his own castle. But what my father never told Chloe, what he never told the church congregation or his wealthy golf buddies, was that 5 years ago, he nearly lost Big Mama's house to the bank forever. A series of terrible real estate investments had completely drained his accounts, and the bank was days away from foreclosing on the property. In a moment of absolute desperation, he had come to me crying in my living room. I stepped in and used my stellar credit and substantial financial savings to restructure the massive loan. I did not just co-sign to help him out. I bought the debt. I became the primary legal guarantor of the $450,000 mortgage. The deed was quietly placed into a private trust that I solely controlled. Reginald was allowed to live there and pay the monthly installments, but legally, I held the absolute ultimate power over that property and the ground it sat on. My father, in his blind arrogance, had forgotten the golden rule of business and finance. Never threaten the person who holds your paper. By declaring his intention to legally sever me from the family trust, Reginald thought he was punishing me and protecting Trent. He thought he was kicking me out of the family forever. He had absolutely no idea that by initiating legal action to alter our financial relationship, he was handing me the exact legal grounds I needed to protect my own assets. I clicked on the mortgage management tab on my screen. I opened the guarantor release forms I had drafted months ago when I first noticed Trent draining my father's secondary lines of credit to pay for his lifestyle. I reviewed the legal terms one last time. By withdrawing my financial backing, I would automatically trigger an immediate due on sale and transfer clause written into the fine print of the contract. The bank algorithm would instantly recognize that the primary guarantor with the capital was no longer securing the high-risk loan. The entire $450,000 balance would become payable immediately. If they could not produce the cash, the bank would freeze the associated credit lines within 24 hours and initiate an automated foreclosure process. My finger hovered over the laptop trackpad. I thought about the beautifully decorated Thanksgiving table I was no longer allowed to sit at. I thought about my mother Vivian, who stood by silently while my father disowned me over a spoiled child's entitled husband. I took a deep breath and pressed enter. The screen refreshed immediately. A bright green checkmark appeared confirming the withdrawal was successful. The legal wheels were now in motion, and there was absolutely nothing Reginald or his fancy corporate lawyer could do to stop the financial avalanche that was about to hit his perfect suburban life. I closed the laptop, turned off the office light, and went to sleep with a profound, incredible sense of peace. I slept completely soundly for the first time in weeks without grinding my teeth. When my alarm woke me up at exactly 9:00 the next morning, the warm autumn sunlight was pouring brightly through my bedroom windows. I stretched and reached for my phone resting on the nightstand. The screen was completely filled with frantic notifications. There were exactly 89 missed calls. Most of them were from my father and my mother, but the most recent urgent voicemails were from a number I recognized immediately from my corporate dealings. It was my father's ruthless corporate lawyer. I tapped the voicemail icon and lifted the phone to my ear. The lawyer's voice was completely stripped of its usual arrogant southern drawl. He sounded completely out of breath, frantic, and utterly terrified. "Maya, please pick up the phone," he pleaded into the receiver. "Reginald did not tell me you were the primary guarantor on the estate trust. The bank just issued a massive default notice and completely froze all of their checking and credit accounts. We need to stop this right now before they lose the house entirely. Please call me back the second you get this." I smiled softly to myself in the quiet morning light and deleted the message. The real game had just begun. I deleted the lawyer's frantic voicemail and got out of bed. I took a hot shower, put on my sharpest navy blue power suit, and drove to my corporate office on the 30th floor of a sleek glass high-rise overlooking downtown Atlanta. The morning started like any other Tuesday. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, reviewed my risk assessment portfolios, and enjoyed the quiet, focused hum of the financial district. I knew a massive storm was brewing across town, but I had absolutely no idea the chaos would walk right through my glass office doors before lunchtime. At exactly 11:15, my assistant buzzed my intercom. She sounded incredibly stressed. Before she could even finish her sentence, my solid oak office door swung open violently. It was Trent. My sister Chloe's husband stood in the doorway looking like he had just sprinted up 30 flights of stairs. His face was blotchy and red. He was wearing one of his expensive custom-tailored Italian suits, but the silk tie was loosened and sweat was visibly soaking through the collar. He slammed the door behind him, completely ignoring my assistant, who was hovering nervously in the hallway. I simply waved her off and motioned for her to go back to her desk. Trent marched right up to my mahogany desk and planted his hands flat on the polished surface, leaning over to try and physically intimidate me. He did not know about the lawyer calling my phone. He did not know about the mortgage default I had triggered the night before. All he knew was that I had officially refused to give him the $50,000 he demanded, and he was furious. "Listen to me very carefully, Maya," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and entitlement. "You are going to wire that money to my business account by noon today, or I am going to make your life a living hell. I know the senior partners at this firm. I play golf with them. I will personally march into their offices and tell them exactly what kind of unhinged, selfish person they have handling their high-profile compliance accounts. You think you are so smart, but you are just a bitter single workaholic who cannot stand the fact that Chloe has a loving husband, a beautiful house, and a perfect life." Trent stood up straight, crossing his arms with a smug look on his face. He actually thought he had won. He genuinely believed that his privilege and his empty threats were enough to bully a senior financial officer in her own domain. I did not flinch. I did not reach for the phone to call corporate security. I just sat back in my leather chair and took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. "You are very brave to come into my office and threaten my career, Trent," I said calmly, setting the mug down. "But you are also incredibly stupid." I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick manila folder. I tossed it onto the center of the desk, right between his hands. He looked down at it, his smug expression faltering for a split second. "What is this?" he asked, his tone losing a bit of its aggressive edge. "It is a forensic audit," I replied, leaning forward and lacing my fingers together. "When my father came to me last week, demanding I invest $50,000 into your new tech startup, I did exactly what I do for a living. I ran a complete financial risk assessment on your company." I opened the folder and flipped to the first highlighted page, turning it around so he could read the numbers. "You do not have a tech startup, Trent. You have a shell company that you are using to embezzle money from the family trust." I pointed to a series of highlighted bank transfers. "Last month you withdrew $15,000 from the business account to put a down payment on a brand new Porsche. 2 weeks later you wired $8,000 to an offshore sports betting site. There are zero payroll records. zero software development invoices, and absolutely zero proof of any viable product. You are broke, Trent, and you are desperate. Trent's face went from flush red to a sickly pale white in a matter of seconds. He stared at the highlighted bank statements as if they were written in an alien language. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The arrogant businessman who had just threatened to ruin my career was suddenly hyperventilating in his tailored suit. "You have no right to look into my private finances," he finally stammered, taking a step back from the desk. "When you ask me for $50,000 of my hard-earned money, your finances become my business." I fired back, my voice cold and steady. "But that is not even the best part, Trent. You see, I did not just audit your fake company. I audited the secondary line of credit attached to Big Mama's house. The one you and Chloe have been secretly draining for the past 2 years to fund your lavish lifestyle." Before Trent could even process that piece of information, his cell phone began to vibrate violently in his jacket pocket. He flinched as if the device had physically shocked him. He pulled it out and stared at the caller identification. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. "Answer it," I said, gesturing toward the phone. "It is the bank, I guarantee it." Trent's hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped the device. He swiped the screen and brought the phone to his ear. He did not say hello. He just listened. I watched as his eyes widened in absolute terror. The confident golden boy persona shattered entirely right in front of me. "Yes, this is him," Trent whispered into the phone. "What do you mean the account is frozen?" "Wait, you cannot do that. I have automatic payments scheduled for tomorrow." "What guarantor withdrawal? What default notice? Listen to me. You need to unfreeze that credit line immediately." Trent was practically begging, pacing back and forth across my office rug. He ran a hand through his hair, pulling at the roots. "No, you do not understand," he pleaded. "If I do not have access to those funds by tomorrow, my car gets repossessed." "Hello? Hello?" He pulled the phone away from his ear. The bank representative had hung up on him. The secondary line of credit was officially dead. The money well had completely dried up. Trent stared blindly at the wall, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world burn to ashes. Without saying another word to me, he turned around and bolted out of my office, practically running down the hallway toward the elevators. I watched him go, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. The dominoes were falling exactly as I had planned. I reached out and closed the manila folder, tucking it neatly back into my desk drawer. Less than 30 seconds later, my cell phone buzzed on the desk. A text message illuminated the screen. It was from my mother, Vivian. "What did you say to Trent?" she wrote. "He just called Chloe in a full panic attack. He can barely breathe. You are tearing this family apart, Maya. Your father is furious. He is calling the lawyer right now to take the house out of your name today." I picked up my phone and smiled. They still did not understand the gravity of the situation. My father genuinely believed he could just call his attorney, draft a few documents, and erase me from the deed. He did not realize that the house was tied to a trust, and the trust was bound by the primary guarantor. By trying to legally attack me, he had unknowingly pulled the pin on a financial grenade. The bank was not just freezing credit lines, they were preparing to demand the entire $450,000 mortgage balance in full. I typed a 2-word reply to my mother. "Good luck." I hit send, put my phone on silent, and turned my attention back to my computer monitor. I took another sip of my coffee, letting the quiet ambiance of my office wash over me. The 24-hour countdown had officially started. The legal reality was about to hit my family like a runaway freight train, and I was not going to interrupt their moment of realization. The rest of my workday was a masterclass in compartmentalization. While I sat in my quiet office reviewing corporate compliance reports, my phone screen silently lit up over and over again. By 12:00 noon, there were exactly 15 missed calls. 10 were from my mother, Vivian, and 5 were from my father, Reginald. I did not answer a single one. I simply let the screen go dark and returned to my spreadsheets. During that quiet waiting period, I found myself staring out the window at the Atlanta skyline, thinking about my mother. Vivian had spent her entire adult life enabling my father's worst financial behaviors. She was the woman who had watched me work 3 part-time jobs in college just to keep my head above water. When I was a senior, my father suddenly announced he could not help me with my final semester tuition because he had just paid for Chloe's extravagant destination wedding in the Bahamas. I had to skip my own college graduation ceremony because I was picking up extra shifts at a local bank to pay off my student debt. Vivian had simply patted my hand and told me that family requires sacrifice. Now the very people who demanded my sacrifice were drowning in the financial reality I had protected them from for years. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the missed call counter on my phone hit 45. The frequency of the calls told me everything I needed to know. The bank had officially moved past the warning stage. They must have sent the formal default notice via emergency courier directly to the house. The entire $450,000 balance was now due in full, and the reality of their situation was finally setting in. At 6 o'clock, I packed my laptop into my leather briefcase and took the private elevator down to the executive parking garage. As I sat in the driver's seat of my car, I checked my screen one last time. There were now 89 missed calls. It was a beautiful, undeniable record of their mounting panic. As I pulled out of the parking garage, the screen illuminated once more. It was not my parents. It was the corporate lawyer again. This time I decided they had suffered enough silence. I pressed accept and connected the call to my car's Bluetooth speaker system. "Maya, thank God you finally answered." The lawyer practically gasped into the receiver. His polished professional demeanor was completely gone. He sounded like a man who was watching his career go up in flames. I kept my voice perfectly level. "Good evening, counselor. I assume you are calling about the default notice." "You have to stop this immediately," he pleaded, his voice echoing through my car's speakers. "Reginald lied to me, Maya. He sat in my office and swore to me that you were just a minor co-signer on the secondary loan. He completely omitted the fact that you held the primary guarantor status and that the deed was locked in a private trust you controlled. When I filed the initial paperwork to have you severed from the estate, it triggered an automatic security breach in your trust. The bank froze everything. They are initiating the foreclosure process tomorrow morning." I merged onto the highway, keeping my eyes on the road. "I am fully aware of the bank's protocols, counselor," I replied. "I wrote the trust agreement myself. When my father threatened to legally sever me from the family, he activated a clause designed to protect my assets from hostile entities. My father is now a hostile entity." The lawyer was hyperventilating now. "Maya, please, Reginald is sitting right here in my office. He is beside himself. We can withdraw the severance paperwork right now. We can pretend none of this ever happened. Just call the bank and reinstate your guarantor status before they seize the property." "I will not be calling the bank," I said coldly, "and I have absolutely no interest in speaking with you any further. Put the man who canceled my Thanksgiving on the phone." There was a brief muffled shuffle on the other end of the line. Then my father's voice came through the speakers. He tried to use his booming, authoritative tone, but I could hear the slight tremor of genuine fear underneath it. "Maya, what on earth do you think you are doing?" he demanded. "You are completely out of your mind. You are going to lose the house. You are going to lose everything Big Mama worked for." "I am not losing anything, Reginald," I corrected him, refusing to call him Dad. "My condo is fully paid off. My savings are secure. You, on the other hand, are about to lose the roof over your head." My father took a shaky breath and shifted his tactics. He tried to use the ultimate cultural weapon against me. He tried to use guilt. "Maya, you listen to me," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "This is Big Mama's house. This is our ancestral home. This is where our family gathers. You are going to let a white-owned bank take the very legacy our ancestors bled for all over a petty disagreement about Trent. You are disrespecting the family name. You are disrespecting your grandmother. How will you ever face the church congregation knowing you made your own parents homeless right before the holidays?" I gripped the steering wheel, letting his manipulative words wash over me without leaving a single mark. For 35 years, that guilt trip would have worked. It would have brought me to my knees. But today it just sounded pathetic. "Do not you dare invoke Big Mama's name to me!" I fired back, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the car. You disrespected her legacy the second you used her historic home as a personal piggy bank to fund a fraudulent lifestyle for your spoiled white son-in-law. You drained the equity she built to pay for Trent's sports cars and Chloe's luxury vacations. You treated me like an automated teller machine while you treated them like royalty. Now the bill has come due. Maya, please, my father whispered. The anger was gone, replaced by absolute desperation. We do not have $450,000. We do not even have $50,000. Trent drained the secondary accounts completely. We have nothing. That sounds like a personal financial crisis, Reginald, I said smoothly, pulling into my gated community. You have exactly 48 hours to secure a new loan from a different lender and buy out my portion of the trust. If you cannot produce $450,000 by Thursday evening, the bank will proceed with the foreclosure and the sheriff's department will be there to escort you off the property. Have a wonderful evening. I pressed the end call button on my steering wheel, cutting off his frantic protests. The car was blissfully silent again. I parked in my assigned space and walked up to my condo. I felt lighter than I had in years. I had finally drawn the line and enforced it with absolute extreme prejudice. But a family like mine does not surrender easily. They were entirely out of financial options, so they immediately turned to the only weapon they had left: social destruction. By the time I unlocked my front door and walked into my living room, my phone was vibrating with a new wave of notifications. It was not the lawyer this time. It was Facebook. Chloe had just gone live and she was ready for war. I stood in my living room staring at my phone screen as Chloe broadcasted her performance to our entire extended family and the local church congregation. She was sitting on the floor of her massive living room, wearing an oversized college sweatshirt, with her makeup perfectly smudged to look like she had been crying for hours. She looked directly into the camera and told hundreds of people that her greedy corporate sister was trying to render her parents and her young children homeless right before Thanksgiving. She did not mention the $450,000 mortgage I had carried for them for the past 5 years. She did not mention the forensic audit I had conducted proving her husband was a fraud. She just painted a picture of a heartless, bitter woman who hated her own family. Within minutes, my phone began vibrating with a relentless wave of notifications. There were angry text messages from my aunts and uncles. Several women from our church sent me long paragraphs calling me a disgrace to the community and quoting scriptures about honoring my mother and father. My mother Vivian left a sobbing voicemail saying that I was officially dead to her and that I had publicly humiliated our bloodline. I did not block anyone. I did not turn off my phone. I simply let them expose exactly who they were. I knew that a public smear campaign was the desperate last resort of people who had completely run out of financial options. They could not fix the massive default with the bank, so they were trying to bully me into submission using social pressure. The next evening, I pulled my car into my gated community after another long day at the corporate office. I was looking forward to a quiet dinner, but as I turned onto my street, I saw a familiar silver luxury sedan parked illegally right across my driveway. It was Trent's car. They had tailgated another resident through the security gates to bypass the guards. Before I even had a chance to put my car in park, the doors of the sedan swung open. Reginald, Vivian, Chloe, and Trent all stepped out onto the pavement. They formed a physical barricade blocking my path to my own front door. I turned off the engine, grabbed my leather briefcase, and stepped out of the car into the cool autumn air. The tension in the driveway was incredibly thick. I could see several of my neighbors already peeking through their blinds to watch the commotion. Vivian was the first to speak. Her voice was trembling with manufactured rage. She screamed at me, demanding that I fix what I had broken. She pointed a manicured finger at my face and told me that I was an ungrateful child who was destroying the family name out of pure jealousy. Chloe stood slightly behind her, wiping away fresh tears and playing the fragile victim perfectly. Reginald stepped forward, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. He thrust a crumpled piece of paper toward my chest. It was a hastily drafted legal waiver. He demanded that I sign my rights to the house over to him immediately for $0. He said if I signed it, they would tell the church that it was all a big misunderstanding and welcome me back into the family. Trent stood right next to him, crossing his arms aggressively and telling me that I did not have a choice anymore because the whole community was turning against me. I looked at the four of them standing in my driveway. This was my family, this united front of entitlement and manipulation. They genuinely believed that if they yelled loud enough and threatened my reputation, I would simply fold and hand over a $500,000 asset. I felt a profound sense of clarity wash over me. It was finally time to drop the hammer and shatter their illusion completely. I did not flinch. I looked at my brother-in-law and told Trent to take a huge step back before I called the police and had him arrested for trespassing. Then I reached into my briefcase. I did not pull out a pen to sign their ridiculous waiver. Instead, I pulled out my digital tablet. I tapped the screen and opened the full forensic audit file I had compiled on Trent's fake business. I turned the volume all the way up and pressed play on an audio file. It was a recorded voicemail I had legally extracted from Trent's business phone records during my investigation. A high-pitched woman's voice echoed loudly through the quiet suburban driveway. She was demanding her monthly allowance and complaining that Trent had not visited her apartment in weeks. She explicitly mentioned the luxury hotel they had stayed at the previous weekend, using the money he had stolen from my father. Chloe's jaw dropped completely open. The fake tears stopped instantly. She slowly turned her head to look at her husband. Trent's aggressive posture vanished in a heartbeat. He shrank back against the side of his car, his face turning a sickening shade of gray. He raised his hands, trying to formulate a sentence, but his voice completely failed him. But I was not finished. Before any of them could fully process the infidelity, I handed my father the printed bank documents from the forensic audit. I pointed directly to the signature line on the secondary loan application, the exact loan Trent and Chloe had used to drain the equity out of Big Mama's house to fund their lifestyle. "Look closely at your own signature, Reginald," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the cold night air. "You did not sign that document. Trent and Chloe forged your name to extract that money. They did not just borrow from you, they committed federal wire fraud against you." Reginald stared at the paper in his hands. His eyes darted from the forged signature to Trent, and then to his beloved golden child Chloe. Vivian covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a quiet gasp of horror. The silence that fell over the driveway was absolute and heavy. The united front of the perfect family had just shattered into a million irreversible pieces right there on the concrete. Nobody moved for a long time. The crickets chirped loudly in the background, filling the heavy silence of the cold autumn night. Trent tried to reach out and touch Chloe's arm, but she physically recoiled from him as if he were made of fire. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of profound betrayal and public humiliation. Reginald looked like he had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. The proud, booming patriarch of our family dropped the forged bank documents onto the concrete driveway. He turned his back on his favorite daughter and walked slowly toward his car, his shoulders completely slumped. Vivian followed him, weeping silently into her hands without looking back. Trent and Chloe were left standing alone in the dark next to the silver luxury sedan they had financed with stolen equity. I picked up the fallen papers from the ground, placed them neatly back into my leather briefcase, and walked inside my condo, locking the heavy deadbolt behind me. The war was officially over, but the terms of their surrender had not been signed yet. Thursday morning arrived. For the first time in my entire 35 years of life, I did not wake up to the smell of Vivian baking sweet potato pies or roasting a massive turkey. There was no warm laughter, no cousins running through the hallways, and no matching holiday outfits. Instead of gathering around a beautifully decorated dining table, my family found themselves sitting in the sterile glass-walled conference room of a downtown Atlanta mediation center. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a harsh, pale glow on everyone's exhausted faces. I sat alone at the head of the large mahogany table, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, feeling completely calm and in absolute control. The mediator was a stern, retired judge with a thick silver beard and absolutely no patience for family drama. He opened his thick manila file and laid out the cold, hard facts of the situation. He explained in a very flat, clinical tone, that the bank was legally within its rights to execute the foreclosure by 5:00 that evening, because the primary guarantor had withdrawn the loan was in total default. He then adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Trent and Chloe. He stated that the secondary line of credit contained forged signatures, which elevated this situation from a simple civil property dispute to a massive federal wire fraud case. The mediator warned them that the bank had already flagged the fraudulent transfers. If a formal police report was filed, they were both looking at serious time in a federal prison. That was all it took for Trent's true colors to shine under the bright office lights. The man my father had treated like royalty immediately folded to save his own skin. Trent stood up aggressively, pushing his chair back and pointing an accusing finger directly at his wife. He told the mediator and my parents that the forgery was entirely Chloe's idea. He claimed she was obsessed with maintaining her wealthy image for her friends, and had forced him to sign my father's name just to keep up appearances. Chloe let out a blood-curdling scream and lunged across the table, grabbing Trent by his expensive silk tie. She called him a liar, a cheat, and a coward, screaming at the top of her lungs about the mistress I had exposed in the driveway. She hit his chest with her fist, crying that he had ruined her life. Trent shoved her away forcefully and loudly announced to the entire room that he was filing for divorce immediately. He stated he would be seeking full custody of their children to protect them from her criminal behavior and financial ruin. Vivian completely broke down. She sobbed uncontrollably into her hands, begging Reginald to do something to stop the madness. She pleaded with him to fix the family. But my father just sat there frozen. He stared blankly at the polished wood of the conference table. He was utterly broken by the monsters he had created and protected for so long. He had sacrificed his relationship with me, his responsible, hard-working daughter, to fund the illusion of a perfect family. Now that illusion had violently imploded right in front of his eyes, leaving him with absolutely nothing. The mediator cleared his throat loudly, demanding order in the room. He turned back to my parents and stated that the only way to stop the bank from seizing the property was to buy the house back at full market value today. It was a sum they obviously did not have. Absolute silence filled the room again. That was my exact cue. I unzipped my leather portfolio and pulled out a certified cashier's check. I slid it slowly across the smooth table toward the mediator. I announced clearly that I was paying off the remaining $450,000 mortgage balance in cash immediately. Big Mama's historic house would not be going to the bank today. It belonged entirely to me. Reginald looked up, his eyes red and filled with a confusing mix of relief and profound shame. "Thank you, Maya," he whispered, his voice barely audible, cracking under the weight of his emotions. But I held up my hand to stop him. I told him he misunderstood the situation entirely. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out a second stack of papers, sliding them over to his side of the table. It was a legally binding residential lease agreement. I explained that the house was now officially my private rental property. They were welcome to stay in the home, but they would pay me a strict market rate rent on the first day of every single month. If they were late by even 1 week, I would file for eviction without hesitation. Furthermore, I pointed out an ironclad clause on the second page legally, barring Trent and Chloe from ever setting foot on the premises again. Vivian stopped crying and stared at me in absolute horror. Her hands shook as she looked at the lease agreement. "Maya," she choked out, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Are you really going to make your own parents pay you rent to live in your grandmother's house?" I looked my mother dead in the eyes, feeling absolutely no remorse for the boundaries I was finally setting. "You are not paying your daughter Vivian?" I replied, my tone completely flat and unwavering. "You are paying your landlord. Thanksgiving is canceled, remember." After sending that final text message to my mother, I placed my phone face down on the polished mahogany surface of my desk. The screen continued to light up, casting a faint, persistent glow against the wood, but I completely ignored it. I turned my attention back to my dual computer monitors. As a senior compliance officer, I am highly trained to compartmentalize stressful situations. I spent the next few hours auditing complex risk portfolios for my corporate clients, while my own family experienced the greatest financial risk event of their entire lives. The quiet hum of the office air conditioning and the distant sounds of downtown Atlanta traffic provided a peaceful backdrop to the chaos I knew was unfolding across the city. By 12 o'clock noon, I finally paused my work and flipped my phone over to check the screen. The notification panel showed exactly 15 missed calls. 10 of those calls were from my mother Vivian, and 5 were from my father Reginald. There were also half a dozen frantic text messages demanding that I answer the phone immediately and explaining that Trent was in a state of absolute distress. I did not reply to a single one. I simply opened my bottom desk drawer, pulled out my lunch, and ate my salad, while the phone continued to vibrate silently beside my keyboard. During that quiet waiting period, I found myself opening a hidden encrypted folder on my personal laptop. It contained years of old digital family photos. I clicked on an album labeled Chloe's Wedding. The bright, high-definition images filled my screen, showing my younger sister in a custom imported silk gown, standing next to Trent under a massive imported floral archway. It was an incredibly lavish, extravagant event that cost well over $80,000. My father Reginald had insisted on inviting half of the city to show off his wealth and success to his fraternity brothers, his business associates, and our entire church congregation. He wanted everyone to see him as the ultimate provider. What those beautiful professional photographs did not show was the ugly financial reality behind the scenes. Just 3 weeks before that wedding, Reginald realized he had completely overextended his credit lines. The luxury venue was threatening to cancel the reservation entirely if they did not receive the final payment. Vivian, my mother, came to my small apartment crying her eyes out. She sat on my worn second-hand couch and begged me to help them. She told me that Reginald would be entirely humiliated if the wedding was downsized and that the family name would be ruined in our community. I was 22 years old at the time, working 3 part-time jobs just to pay my way through my senior year of college. I had finally saved enough money to comfortably cover my final semester tuition and my basic living expenses. But Vivian pleaded with me, using every ounce of cultural and maternal guilt she possessed. She told me that Chloe needed this perfect day to start her new life, and that as the older, responsible sister, it was my fundamental duty to step up and protect the family. I ended up draining my entire savings account to pay the catering company and the luxury venue deposit. Because of that massive financial hit, I could not afford to take any time off from work during my final exams. I had to take on extra shifts just to keep my electricity turned on. While my family was drinking expensive champagne, eating filet mignon, and dancing at a luxury country club estate, I was working a double shift at a local bank call center. I had a cap and gown hanging in my closet that I never got to wear. I completely missed my own college graduation ceremony. I spent that entire weekend watching my classmates celebrate their achievements on social media while I dealt with angry customers over the phone. When I finally brought the situation up to my mother weeks later, expressing how deeply hurt I was, Vivian simply patted my hand and told me that family requires sacrifice. She told me that I was strong and could handle it, but Chloe was delicate and needed the support. Vivian never once acknowledged that I was the only person in the family doing the sacrificing. She had spent her entire adult life enabling my father's financial abuse and protecting his fragile ego at the direct expense of my own future. I closed the photo album on my laptop and took a deep, steadying breath. The bitter resentment that used to burn fiercely inside my chest was completely gone. It had been replaced by a cold, clinical focus. I checked the time on my computer monitor. It was now exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I glanced down at my phone screen again. The missed call counter had jumped from 15 to 45. The rapid frequency of the calls told me everything I needed to know about the escalating situation at Big Mama's house. The initial shock of Trent's frozen credit cards had worn off, and absolute terror was officially setting in. The bank was not just freezing their secondary accounts anymore. They were moving aggressively onto the next phase of the default protocol, and my parents were finally realizing that I was not going to swoop in and save them this time. I spent the rest of the afternoon wrapping up my compliance reports and sending out my final emails for the day. I packed my laptop into my leather briefcase, organized my desk perfectly, and walked to the private executive elevator. I rode down to the secure parking garage in complete silence. By the time I reached my car and sat in the comfortable leather driver's seat, it was exactly 6 o'clock in the evening. The sun was beginning to set over the city, casting long shadows across the concrete pillars of the garage. I picked up my phone to check the final tally before my drive home. The counter on my lock screen had reached exactly 89 missed calls. There was a solid wall of notifications practically bleeding off the edge of the screen. Alongside the missed calls, a new secure email notification popped up. It was an automated message forwarded directly from the banking system. I tapped the screen and opened the attachment. It was a digital copy of the formal default notice that had just been hand-delivered to my father's front door by an emergency legal courier. The legal document was incredibly clear and completely ruthless. It stated that because the primary guarantor had formally withdrawn all financial backing, the entire mortgage was now classified as a high-risk terminal default. The bank had officially notified my father that the $450,000 balance was due in full immediately. There would be no extensions, no payment plans, and no negotiations. If the funds were not wired to the bank within a matter of days, the property would be seized. The legal wheels were spinning at full speed, and the grand illusion of my perfect wealthy family was collapsing brick by brick. Reginald could no longer hide behind his tailored suits and his booming voice. The financial truth was sitting right there on his front porch. As I put my car in drive and pulled out of my parking space, my phone began to ring once more. I looked at the dashboard display. This time, it was not Reginald, Vivian, or Chloe calling to scream at me. The caller identification displayed the name of my father's high-priced corporate lawyer. The 24-hour countdown was reaching its absolute breaking point, and the professionals were finally getting involved. I pressed the accept button on my steering wheel, and the Bluetooth system in my car connected with a soft chime. I did not say hello. I simply let the silence stretch across the line, waiting to see how he would approach me. The voice that echoed through my car speakers did not belong to the confident, aggressive attorney who had left me a condescending voicemail just yesterday. Instead, the man sounded completely out of breath. The polished southern drawl was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic, rapid speech of a professional who realized he was standing on the edge of a massive legal cliff. "Maya, please do not hang up the phone," the lawyer pleaded. The background noise on his end was chaotic. I could hear papers shuffling and muffled voices arguing in what sounded like a corporate conference room. "I am calling to formally request an immediate halt to the withdrawal protocols you initiated last night. We have a severe misunderstanding on our hands, and we need to rectify it before the banking algorithms finalize the foreclosure." I merged my car onto the highway, keeping my eyes perfectly focused on the road ahead. "I assure you, counselor, there is no misunderstanding on my end," I replied, my voice completely level and devoid of any emotion. I received a voicemail from my father stating his intention to legally sever me from the family trust. "I simply took the necessary steps to protect my own financial assets before your paperwork could be filed. I am entirely within my legal rights." The lawyer let out a heavy, exhausted sigh that sounded dangerously close to a sob. "You do not understand, Maya," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Reginald lied to me. He sat right here in my leather chair yesterday afternoon and completely misrepresented the financial structure of his estate. He told me you were just a minor co-signer on a secondary loan. He told me that removing your name would be a simple administrative procedure. He completely omitted the fact that you held the primary guarantor status, and he absolutely never mentioned that the deed to the property was locked inside a private trust that you solely controlled." I listened to him panic, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. My father, in his blind arrogance and his desperate need to maintain his wealthy image, had lied to his own legal counsel. He was so accustomed to controlling the narrative in our family that he actually believed he could control the legal reality of a $450,000 mortgage. "When I drafted the severance paperwork your father requested," the lawyer continued, his voice trembling, "the legal filing automatically pinged the banking system. Because your trust is ironclad, The bank interpreted my filing as a hostile takeover attempt against the primary guarantor. It triggered an automatic security breach. That breach, combined with your direct withdrawal of financial backing, signaled a total high-risk default. The bank immediately froze every single account attached to that address. I smiled softly in the dim light of my car. That is the fundamental problem with blindly trusting arrogant men, counselor. You filed legal documents against a private property trust without doing a basic title check or a preliminary financial audit. You took Reginald at his word because he wears expensive suits and plays golf at your country club. Now you have inadvertently triggered the complete financial ruin of your own client. In my line of work, we call that a massive failure of due diligence. The lawyer was completely silent for a moment, absorbing the brutal reality of his own malpractice. He knew I was right. He knew that if this went to court, his firm would look incredibly incompetent. He cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of professional composure, but the panic was still bleeding through every word. "Listen to me, Maya," he begged, dropping the formal legal jargon entirely. The bank sent the formal default notice via emergency courier. It arrived at the house an hour ago. The foreclosure department is not waiting 30 days. Because of the high-risk flags and the sheer amount of the loan, they are initiating the physical foreclosure process tomorrow morning. If we do not stop this right now, your parents are going to lose their home. They will be evicted. We can fix this. We can withdraw the severance paperwork right now and pretend none of this ever happened. Just log back into your portal, call the bank representative, and reinstate your guarantor status. Please. I tapped my fingers lightly against the leather steering wheel. The sheer audacity of his request was almost comical. After 35 years of being treated like a disposable emergency fund after being uninvited to Thanksgiving dinner so my father could fund a fake business for his white son-in-law, I was now being asked to simply click a button and make it all go away. They wanted me to absorb the disrespect and save them from the consequences of their own actions, just like I always did. "I am not calling the bank," I said coldly, my voice cutting through his desperate pleading like a knife. "And I have absolutely no interest in speaking with you any further. You are just a hired gun, trying to cover your own professional mistakes. You do not hold any power here." "Maya, please." The lawyer started again, but I immediately cut him off. "Put the man who canceled my Thanksgiving on the phone," I demanded. "I will only speak to Reginald." There was a tense, heavy silence on the line. I could hear the lawyer breathing heavily. Then there was the muffled sound of a hand covering the receiver, followed by hushed, frantic whispering. The phone was being passed across the room. A few seconds later, the ambient noise shifted. I heard the sharp intake of a familiar breath. Maya. It was my father. He tried to use his booming authoritative tone, the one he always used, to intimidate me when I was a child. But it did not work anymore. Without the backing of his fake wealth and his stolen equity, his voice sounded hollow. It sounded weak. The foundation of his entire world was crumbling beneath his feet, and he was finally forced to speak to the daughter he had thrown away. "Maya." He began, his voice heavy with a manufactured exhaustion. "You have made your point. You are angry about Thanksgiving, and you are angry about Trent. I understand that you feel overlooked, but what you are doing right now is completely out of line. You are playing a very dangerous game with our lives, and it needs to stop immediately. I need you to pull your car over, open your laptop, and reinstate your guarantor status before the bank finalizes the paperwork tomorrow morning. We can sit down like adults and figure out the money later." I kept my eyes locked on the red taillights of the car in front of me. "I am not playing a game, Reginald," I replied, my tone dangerously calm. "I am executing a legally binding financial protocol. You told me you were having your lawyer draw up papers to sever me from the family trust. I simply beat you to the punch. You wanted me out of the family, and now I am out. The $450,000 mortgage is now entirely your responsibility." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Reginald realized that his usual methods of intimidation were completely useless against me. He could not fire me. He could not ground me. He could not cut off my allowance because I was the one funding his life. So he pivoted to the only weapon he had left. He dropped the authoritarian patriarch routine and shifted seamlessly into the role of the deeply wounded elder. He decided to play the ultimate family card. "Maya, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice dropping an octave to sound thick with emotion. "We are not just talking about a piece of real estate here. We are talking about Big Mama's house. We are talking about our ancestral home." He paused, letting the weight of my grandmother's memory hang in the digital space between us. "You know exactly how hard your grandmother worked to buy that property?" Reginald continued. "She scrubbed floors for wealthy white families in Buckhead for 30 years, saving every single penny in a tin coffee can under her bed. When she bought that sprawling brick house in 1968, she was the very first black homeowner in that entire neighborhood. People threw rocks through her windows, Maya. But she stood her ground. She fought tooth and nail to build generational wealth so that our family would always have a fortress, so that we would always have a place to gather and be safe." He was really warming up to his performance now. I could hear the self-righteous indignation building in his chest. "And now you are just going to throw it all away," he accused, his voice echoing through my car speakers. "Because you are jealous of your younger sister. You are going to let a white-owned corporate bank swoop in and steal the very legacy our ancestors bled for. You are handing our history over to strangers. How will you ever face the church congregation knowing you destroyed Black generational wealth? How do you think Big Mama is looking down on you right now, knowing you made your own parents homeless right before the holidays?" The silence that followed his speech was incredibly heavy. For a brief second, the ghosts of my childhood trauma flared up in my chest. For 35 years, that exact brand of cultural and religious guilt had controlled my every move. It was the same guilt Vivian had used to drain my savings for Chloe's wedding. It was the same guilt that kept me working overtime to cover their missed property taxes. They had always weaponized my respect for our ancestors to keep me entirely compliant. But as I drove through the cool autumn night, feeling the smooth leather of my steering wheel beneath my hands, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical clarity. The guilt did not work anymore because I finally saw the massive, glaring hypocrisy staring right back at me. "Do not you ever let Big Mama's name cross your lips again," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was sharp enough to cut glass. I heard Reginald physically flinch on the other end of the line. "Big Mama left you that historic house entirely paid off, Reginald." I continued, methodically dismantling his entire argument piece by piece. "She handed you a fortress free and clear of any debt. You are the one who disrespected her legacy. You took out a massive mortgage on her life's work, just so you could throw lavish catered parties and buy luxury vehicles to impress your golf buddies. You almost lost her house to foreclosure 5 years ago, and I had to step in and buy your debt to save it. I am the only reason you are still sleeping in her house." Reginald tried to interrupt, but I did not let him. I raised my voice just enough to drown him out. "And do not you dare lecture me about preserving Black generational wealth and white-owned banks taking our property. You literally committed federal wire fraud to take out a secret secondary line of credit on Big Mama's house. You handed the equity of your Black ancestors over to a mediocre white man. You let Trent drain the lifeblood of this family to buy a Porsche and fund a sports gambling habit. You sold our history to fund your golden child's fake billionaire lifestyle." There was absolutely no sound on the other end of the phone. The silence was absolute and deafening. I had stripped away every single layer of his delusion and forced him to look directly at the ugly, undeniable truth. He had no defense. He could not blame me. He could not blame the bank. He was the architect of his own destruction. "Maya, please," Reginald finally whispered. His voice was completely broken. It sounded like it belonged to a very old, very fragile man. "Trent is family. We were just trying to help him get his business off the ground. We thought he would pay it back. We do not have the money, Maya. We have absolutely nothing left. If you do not stop the bank, we will be out on the street." "That sounds like a personal financial crisis," I replied, my voice returning to its smooth professional cadence. You have exactly 48 hours to secure a new loan from a different lender and buy out my portion of the trust. I want $450,000 wired to my accounts by Thursday evening. Maya, you cannot do this. Reginald pleaded, panic rising in his throat again. You cannot get a loan of that size in 2 days. It is mathematically impossible. Then I highly suggest you start packing your belongings tonight, I stated coldly. Because if that balance is not settled in 48 hours, the bank will proceed with the automated foreclosure and the county sheriff will be there to physically remove you from the property. Maya, you cannot do this to your own flesh and blood, he cried out, his voice cracking completely. I am your father. You have to save us. Please just call the lawyer back and… I reached out and pressed the red button on my steering wheel. The call disconnected instantly, cutting his desperate pleading off mid-sentence. The dashboard screen went dark, and the interior of my car was instantly filled with the quiet, peaceful hum of the engine. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. I felt a massive, invisible weight lift completely off my shoulders. I had finally drawn the absolute hardest boundary of my life, and I had enforced it with extreme precision. I pulled into my gated community and parked my car, feeling lighter than I had in a decade. But as I walked up the pathway to my front door, I knew my family would not simply pack their bags and surrender gracefully. They were entirely out of financial options, and they were completely out of legal options. That meant they were going to turn to the only weapon they had left in their arsenal: social destruction. They were going to try and burn my reputation to the ground. Wednesday morning broke with a deceptive stillness. I woke up, made my bed, and poured a cup of dark roast coffee, preparing for another day of remote work at my kitchen island. The deadline I had given my father was slowly ticking down, but my phone was surprisingly quiet. It was too quiet. I knew my family well enough to understand that their silence was never an indication of surrender. It simply meant they were changing their battle strategy. They had realized that legal threats and emotional guilt trips were completely useless against my financial boundaries. So they pivoted to the most destructive weapon left in their arsenal. At exactly 8:15, my phone screen illuminated. It was not a call from the corporate lawyer, and it was not a message from the bank. It was a direct message on Facebook from a cousin I had not spoken to in 3 years. The message contained no greeting. It was just a single video link accompanied by a text that read, "How could you do this to your own mother?" I set my coffee mug down and clicked the link. It redirected me straight to Chloe's public page. My sister had initiated a full-scale social media war. Chloe was broadcasting to our entire extended family, our community network, and the massive congregation of our local church. The video showed her sitting on the hardwood floor of her extravagant living room. She was wearing an oversized, faded college sweatshirt. Her usually perfect hair was pulled up into a messy, uneven bun. She had carefully smudged her mascara down her cheeks to give the very convincing illusion that she had been violently weeping all night long. She was holding her youngest toddler on her lap, bouncing him gently while staring directly into the camera lens with wide, heartbroken eyes. She started speaking, and her voice was a masterclass in manipulation. It trembled at all the right moments. She told her thousands of followers that her greedy corporate sister had completely lost her mind. She painted a vivid picture of me as a bitter, heartless woman who despised her own bloodline. Chloe claimed that because I was chronically single and deeply jealous of her perfect marriage to Trent, I was using a shady legal loophole to seize our parents' historic home. She cried, telling the camera that I was throwing our elderly mother and father out onto the street right before the holidays purely out of spite. She squeezed out a fresh set of tears and said her innocent children would have nowhere to eat their Thanksgiving dinner because Aunt Maya decided she wanted to steal the family legacy to fund her expensive designer wardrobe. She completely omitted the $450,000 mortgage I had carried on my own back for 5 years to save that exact house. She conveniently forgot to mention the forensic audit sitting on my desk, proving her husband was embezzling money. She entirely left out the fact that she and Trent had forged my father's signature to secretly drain the equity of our ancestral home. She framed the entire situation as an unprovoked, malicious attack on an innocent, God-fearing family. By the time I finished watching the 5-minute clip, the video already had over 300 shares. The psychological warfare was brilliant in its cruelty. This is exactly how toxic family systems operate. When they completely lose their ability to control you, they immediately try to control how other people perceive you. By making the dispute public, Chloe was weaponizing our entire community against me. In our culture, the church family and extended relatives act as a massive moral authority. Chloe knew that if she could get the aunties, the deacons, and the elders to turn on me, the immense social pressure would force me to cave and hand over the house. Her strategy worked flawlessly. Within an hour, my phone began to overheat from the sheer volume of incoming notifications. The comments section beneath Chloe's video was a toxic wasteland of public judgment. People I had known since Sunday school were calling me a monster. Brother Thomas, the choir director, wrote that pride comes before the fall and that I needed to repent. My phone buzzed relentlessly with aggressive text messages. Aunt Clara sent me a massive paragraph quoting scriptures about honoring my mother and father, warning me that I was inviting a generational curse upon my life. A family friend who had known me since I was 5 years old texted me to say I was an absolute disgrace to the Black community and that Big Mama would be deeply ashamed to call me her granddaughter. Then came the ultimate blow. My phone rang loudly against the marble countertop. The caller identification simply read Vivian. I did not pick it up. I watched the screen flash until the call went to voicemail. A minute later, the notification popped up. I tapped the icon and brought the phone to my ear. My mother's voice was entirely devoid of any maternal warmth. It was pure venom, masked as righteous grief. Maya, she said, her voice shaking with manufactured rage. I just watched your sister's video. My phone has been ringing off the hook all morning with people from the congregation asking why my eldest daughter is trying to destroy our lives. You have publicly humiliated this family. You have dragged our good name through the mud for everyone to see. After everything we sacrificed to raise you, this is how you repay us. You are a cold, unnatural woman. As of this moment, you are officially dead to me. Do not ever call me again. The voicemail ended with a sharp click. I sat at my kitchen island, listening to the heavy silence of my apartment. I am a strong, independent woman, but hearing your own mother declare you dead over a voicemail is a unique kind of devastation. It is a deep, visceral ache that settles right in the center of your chest and makes it hard to breathe. For one fleeting second, the little girl inside of me wanted to give up. She wanted to call the bank, pay off the massive debt, and apologize to everyone just to make the pain stop and win back her mother's love. But the 35-year-old financial compliance officer quickly silenced that little girl. I took a deep, steady breath and looked strictly at the facts. Vivian did not disown me because I was a bad daughter. She disowned me because I stopped funding her delusion. She actively chose her golden child and her fraudulent son-in-law over the daughter who had literally kept a roof over her head for half a decade. I did not cry. I did not turn on my camera to record a defensive video explaining my side of the story. Engaging in a public shouting match on social media is a losing game played by desperate people. The truth does not need a public relations campaign. The truth simply requires evidence. I calmly opened the photo gallery on my phone and took careful screenshots of every single nasty text message from my relatives. I saved Chloe's manipulative video directly to my secure hard drive. I documented every hateful comment from the church members and the extended family. I was doing exactly what I did at my corporate job. I was building an airtight compliance file on my own family. Let them talk, I thought to myself as I closed my laptop. Let them paint me as the ultimate villain of their story. Because when the federal fraud charges drop and the real truth is exposed, none of these people will be able to look me in the eye ever again. They thought this digital onslaught would break my spirit before the sun went down. But as the afternoon faded into evening and I still had not called the bank to stop the foreclosure process, they realized their social media campaign was not enough. The cowardice of hiding behind screens was over. They were going to have to come to my home and face me in person. I pulled into the pristine, tree-lined streets of my gated community, just as the streetlights began to flicker on against the darkening sky. The evening air was crisp and the neighborhood was wrapped in its usual quiet, affluent stillness. I was deeply exhausted, dealing with a day full of complex corporate compliance reports while actively ignoring a viral social media smear campaign orchestrated by my own bloodline had completely drained my social battery. All I wanted was to unlock my front door, pour a glass of sparkling water, and enjoy the absolute peace of my sanctuary. As I approached the main security gate, I swiped my resident keycard. The heavy iron gate slowly swung open to let me through. I drove forward, but as I casually glanced in my rearview mirror, I noticed a sleek, silver luxury sedan aggressively accelerating. It was Trent's car. He was tailgating my vehicle so closely that our bumpers were nearly touching, slipping his car through the security perimeter just seconds before the iron gate slammed shut behind him. My heart rate spiked for a fraction of a second, but my hands remained perfectly steady on the steering wheel. They had actually done it. They had completely lost the digital battle on the internet, so they were bringing the war directly to my front porch. I turned down my street and pulled my car into my paved driveway, shifting the gear into park. Before I could even unbuckle my seatbelt, Trent's silver sedan screeched to a violent halt right behind me, completely blocking my car from the street. The doors of the sedan flew open simultaneously. Out stepped Reginald, Vivian, Chloe, and Trent. They looked absolutely unhinged. The polished country club facade they had meticulously maintained for decades was completely gone. Vivian was wearing a wrinkled blouse, her usually immaculate hair looking completely disheveled. Reginald had dark, heavy bags under his eyes, and his suit jacket was missing. Chloe was still wearing the exact same oversized college sweatshirt from her manipulative Facebook Live video. Trent just looked incredibly angry, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter under the pressure. I took a deep breath, grabbed my leather briefcase from the passenger seat, and opened my car door. I stepped out onto the concrete driveway, standing tall in my tailored navy blue work suit. I was not going to cower inside my vehicle. Vivian did not even wait for me to close my car door. She closed the distance between us in a matter of seconds and immediately started screaming. She was not just speaking loudly, she was unleashing a guttural, hysterical scream that completely shattered the quiet suburban evening. "Fix it, Maya!" she shrieked, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "You call that bank right now and you fix what you broke. You are destroying this family. You are a selfish, spiteful little girl who cannot stand to see anyone else happy." Her voice echoed sharply off the brick facades of the surrounding houses. Almost instantly, I saw the blinds part in the living room window of the house directly across the street. My neighbor, an older retired judge, stepped out onto his front porch, holding a watering can, his eyes locked entirely on the spectacle unfolding in my driveway. To my left, a young couple walking their golden retriever stopped dead in their tracks on the sidewalk, openly staring at my screaming mother. I did not raise my voice. I kept my tone completely flat and professional. "Keep your voice down, Vivian," I said firmly. "You are embarrassing yourself in front of my entire neighborhood." "I do not care about your neighbors," she yelled, stepping even closer. "I care about the fact that the bank called us again this afternoon. We have less than 24 hours before they seize the house. You have humiliated us in front of the entire church. Everyone knows what a cold, unnatural daughter you are. Are you happy now, Maya? Are you proud of yourself?" Before I could answer, Chloe pushed past our mother and launched into her carefully rehearsed performance. The tears started flowing instantly, completely on cue. She clutched her designer handbag to her chest and looked at me with wide, devastated eyes. "How can you be so incredibly cruel?" "Maya," she sobbed, making sure her voice was loud enough for the couple on the sidewalk to hear clearly. "Trent and I are trying to build a life. We are trying to raise your nieces and nephews in a stable, loving environment. Why are you doing this to us? Why are you punishing my innocent children just because you are single and miserable? We never did anything to you, thing." It was a stunning display of weaponized victimhood. She was utilizing the exact same script she had used to turn the church congregation against me, but this time she was performing it live in my driveway. She wanted the neighbors to see a heartbroken young mother begging a ruthless corporate executive for mercy. She wanted me to feel so deeply ashamed by the public spectacle that I would simply surrender the $450,000 asset just to make the screaming stop. Trent hovered right behind Chloe, feeding off her manufactured distress. He crossed his arms over his chest and glared at me with absolute contempt. He still believed that his privilege gave him the upper hand. He still thought he could intimidate a black woman on her own property without any consequences. "You need to end this right now," Maya Trent demanded, his voice thick with unearned arrogance. "You have thrown your little temper tantrum. You have made everyone miserable. Now it is time to be an adult and sign the paperwork to fix the massive mess you created. If you do not fix this, I swear I will ruin you." I looked at Trent, feeling a cold, calculating calm settle over my entire body. "You are currently trespassing on private property." "Trent," I stated clearly, my eyes locked directly onto his. "If you do not remove your vehicle from behind mine and step off my driveway immediately, my next call will be to the local police department to have you physically removed." That was the exact moment Reginald completely lost his temper. My father had spent his entire life dominating the people around him with his booming voice and his imposing physical stature. When he realized that Vivian's screaming, Chloe's crying, and Trent's threats were absolutely useless against my ironclad boundaries, he resorted to brute physical intimidation. Reginald lunged forward, moving much faster than I expected for a man his age. He shoved past Vivian and Trent, marching directly into my personal space. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, and he used every single inch of that height to tower over me. He planted his feet firmly on the concrete, physically blocking my only path to the front door. The scent of stale coffee and nervous sweat radiated off his clothes. "You are not calling the police on anyone in this family," he growled, his voice dropping into a menacing, dangerous register. "You are going to stand right here, and you are going to listen to me. I am your father. I gave you life. I put clothes on your back and food in your mouth when you were a child. You owe me everything that you are." He stepped even closer, forcing me to tilt my head back slightly just to maintain eye contact. His chest was practically touching my briefcase. He was actively trying to trigger the scared, compliant little girl who used to shrink away whenever he raised his voice in Big Mama's house. He wanted me to feel physically trapped, entirely isolated, and completely powerless. The driveway was dead silent now. Vivian had stopped screaming. Chloe had paused her fake sobbing. Trent was watching intently. Even the neighbors seemed to hold their collective breath, waiting to see if the massive, angry man was going to physically assault the woman standing perfectly still in front of him. The tension was so thick it felt like the air itself had turned to lead. The driveway remained perfectly still. The only sound was my father's heavy, jagged breathing as he towered over me. Reginald stared down at me, waiting for the frightened little girl inside me to finally break. When I did not drop my gaze or take a single step backward, his expression shifted from anger to desperate frustration. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and forcefully pulled out a folded, crumpled piece of paper. He thrust it aggressively toward my chest, practically shoving it into my face. It was a hastily printed legal waiver. Even in the dim glow of the streetlights, I could clearly read the bold heading at the top. Reginald commanded me to take it. He told me his lawyer had drafted it just a few hours ago. He stated that the document legally relinquished all of my rights as the primary guarantor and transferred the entire property trust back into his name for absolutely $0. "If you sign this right now," Reginald said, his voice tight with desperation, "we can stop the bank tomorrow morning. We will go to the church on Sunday and tell the congregation that you had a change of heart. We will tell everyone that it was just a massive misunderstanding. You can come to Thanksgiving dinner, and we can put this entire ugly mess behind us." It was the most pathetic transactional offer I had ever heard in my entire life. He was literally trying to buy my $450,000 asset with an invitation to eat turkey at a table where I was completely disrespected. Before I could even respond to the sheer absurdity of his demand, Trent stepped out from the shadows of his luxury sedan. My brother-in-law was apparently tired of letting Reginald handle the negotiation. Trent moved aggressively forward, inserting himself right next to my father. He pointed a finger directly at my face, his face completely flushed with unearned confidence. "You are going to sign that paper right now," Maya Trent demanded, his voice dripping with corporate arrogance. "You think you hold all the cards because you work in compliance, but you are completely out of your depth here. You do not have a choice anymore. You have dragged this family through the mud on the internet, and everyone hates you. If you do not sign that waiver tonight, I will personally call the senior partners at your financial firm tomorrow morning. I will tell them you are mentally unstable. I will tell them you are a massive liability. I will make sure you never work in the financial sector of this city ever again." He crossed his arms, puffing out his chest, expecting me to crumble under the weight of his threats. Trent had spent his entire life failing upward, completely shielded from consequences. He actually believed he possessed the power to ruin my meticulously built career simply because he played golf with wealthy men. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I kept my posture perfectly straight and turned my attention completely away from my father. I locked my eyes onto Trent. "You have exactly 5 seconds to take a massive step backward before I pull out my phone and dial 911. I stated, my voice radiating absolute zero coldness. Trent scoffed, trying to maintain his tough exterior. "You are not calling the police." I took one step forward, closing the distance between us. "I am standing on my own private property," I said, articulating every single word with razor-sharp precision. "You are an uninvited white man, trespassing in a highly secure, gated community, actively threatening a black woman in her own driveway. I want you to think very carefully about how that police report is going to read, Trent. I want you to think about how your golf buddies at my firm are going to react when I forward them the security footage of you harassing a senior corporate officer at her private residence. Step back right now." Trent's eyes darted nervously toward the house across the street, where my neighbor was still standing on his porch, watching us intently. The cold, hard reality of the law finally pierced through his blanket of privilege. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. Without saying another word, he slowly uncrossed his arms and took 2 large steps backward, completely retreating behind Reginald. With Trent neutralized, I finally took a moment to look at the entire group standing before me. I looked at Vivian, who was dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch. I looked at Chloe, who was clutching her designer handbag, hiding behind her manufactured victimhood. I looked at Trent, sweating in his expensive suit, terrified of actual accountability. And finally, I looked at Reginald, a man who was willing to physically intimidate his own daughter just to protect a lie. For 35 years, I had desperately wanted these people to love me. I had bent over backward, sacrificing my own financial stability, my own mental health, and my own peace of mind just to earn a fraction of the respect they freely handed to Chloe and Trent. I had always believed that if I just worked hard enough and provided enough support, they would eventually see my value. But standing under the harsh glare of the streetlights, the final remaining illusion completely evaporated. They did not love me. They loved what I could provide for them. They were a united front of pure entitlement. They viewed my success as their personal automated teller machine, and they viewed my boundaries as a malicious attack. There was absolutely no saving this family. They were a rapidly sinking ship, and they were completely furious that I had finally refused to drown with them. I looked down at the crumpled waiver still trembling in my father's outstretched hand. I did not reach for a pen. I did not cry. "I am not signing your paper, Reginald," I said, my voice echoing cleanly in the cool night air. "And I am not coming to Thanksgiving dinner. You are completely out of time, and you are completely out of options." Reginald opened his mouth to shout again, but I cut him off by unlatching the heavy brass lock on my leather briefcase. The sharp click echoed loudly, causing all 4 of them to freeze. They thought they had come to my house to intimidate me into submission. They had absolutely no idea that they had just walked directly into their own execution. It was finally time to drop the hammer. I reached into my open briefcase and bypassed the expensive corporate pen my father expected me to use. Instead, I pulled out my digital tablet. The bright screen illuminated the dark space between us, casting a cold blue glow over Reginald and Trent. I tapped the screen once, unlocking the device, and opened the secure audio file I had extracted from Trent's business phone records during my forensic audit. "You came to my house tonight to threaten my career, Trent," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "You wanted to play the role of the protective husband defending your perfect family from the bitter single sister. Let us see exactly how protective you really are." I turned the volume all the way up to maximum and pressed play. The voice that echoed out of the tablet speakers was not mine, and it certainly was not Chloe's. It was a high-pitched, slightly whiny woman who sounded incredibly annoyed. Her words rang out crystal clear into the quiet suburban driveway. "Hey, Trent. It is Jessica," the voice said. "I am getting really tired of leaving you voicemails. You promised my $3,000 allowance would be wired by Tuesday, and my rent is due tomorrow. You said the secondary business account was flush with cash after we got back from that luxury resort in Miami. Call me back right now, or I'm going to stop being so understanding about your wife." The audio clip ended with a sharp digital beep. The silence that rushed in to fill the driveway was absolute and suffocating. Chloe's jaw literally dropped open. The designer handbag she had been clutching to her chest slipped from her fingers and hit the concrete with a dull thud. Her manufactured tears instantly evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. She slowly turned her head to look at her husband. Trent's aggressive posture vanished in a heartbeat. He shrank back against the side of his silver sedan, his face turning a sickening shade of gray. He raised his hands, palms facing outward, trying to formulate a sentence, but his voice completely failed him. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. The confident, arrogant businessman, who had just threatened to call the senior partners at my firm, was suddenly completely paralyzed by the sound of his own infidelity. But I was not finished. The audio recording was just the appetizer. Before any of them could fully process the reality of the mistress, I reached back into my leather briefcase. I pulled out a thick stack of printed bank documents securely stapled together. I stepped around Trent and handed the packet directly to my father. Reginald took the papers automatically, his eyes still darting between his son-in-law and his daughter in utter confusion. "Look at page 4, Reginald," I commanded, pointing at the documents in his hands. "Look at the signature line on the secondary line of credit application." My father flipped to the 4th page. He squinted in the dim streetlight, bringing the paper closer to his face. I watched his eyes scan the dense legal text and then drop to the bottom right corner of the page. "That is the exact loan Trent and Chloe have been using to drain the equity out of Big Mama's house," I explained, my voice carrying clearly in the cold night air. "The money they used to pay for the silver car parked right behind me. The money they used to fund Trent's failing tech company, his sports gambling habit, and his mistress in Miami. But look very closely at the signature, Reginald. You did not sign that document." Reginald stared at the ink on the page. His chest stopped heaving. His entire body went completely rigid. "Trent and Chloe forged your name to extract that money," I continued, methodically driving the final nail into the coffin of their perfect family. "They used your social security number, and they falsified your signature to take out a massive secondary loan against your primary residence. They did not just borrow money from you, they committed federal wire fraud against you. That is why the bank froze everything yesterday. That is why the automated default was triggered so aggressively. When I withdrew my financial backing, the bank ran a secondary compliance audit and flagged the forged documents immediately." Vivian let out a sharp, gasping sound, covering her mouth with both hands. She stumbled backward a step, bumping into the side of my car. Her eyes were wide with horror as she looked at Chloe. The golden child, the daughter who could do no wrong, the woman Vivian had sacrificed my entire future to protect, had actively participated in stealing their home. Reginald slowly lowered the papers. His eyes darted from the sloppily forged signature to Trent, and then finally to his beloved golden child. The transition was agonizing to watch. The booming, arrogant patriarch, who had tried to physically intimidate me just 2 minutes ago, completely disappeared. He was replaced by a broken, betrayed old man. He realized in that exact moment that the daughter he had thrown away was the only one protecting his legacy. while the daughter he worshipped had actively sold it to a mediocre white man who was cheating on her. "Chloe, you did not," he whispered, his voice cracking under the massive weight of the betrayal. "Tell me you did not do this." Chloe could not even look her father in the eye. She looked down at the concrete, trembling uncontrollably. "Daddy, I am sorry," she sobbed, her voice completely stripped of its usual manipulation. It was real, genuine panic now. "Trent said it was just a temporary loan. He said we would pay it back before you ever found out. We just needed the money to maintain our image." "Maintain your image." Reginald repeated the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. "You stole my mother's house to maintain an image." Trent finally found his voice, trying one last desperate attempt to save himself. "Reginald, listen to me," he stammered, taking a step toward my father. "I was going to pay it back. My new app is about to secure venture capital funding. I just needed a little more runway. Maya is twisting the facts to make us look bad." Reginald did not yell. He did not scream. He simply looked at Trent with a cold, dead expression. He opened his hand and let the crumpled legal waiver, the one he had tried to force me to sign, fall to the concrete driveway. The piece of paper fluttered to the ground, landing right next to Chloe's dropped handbag. The united front of the perfect family shattered into a million irreversible pieces right there on the pavement. There was no more screaming. There were no more threats about ruining my career or turning the church against me. The absolute, undeniable truth had completely leveled them. They had come to my house to bully me into submission, but they were leaving with the realization that they were going to lose their home, their marriage, and potentially their freedom. I looked at the four of them standing in the dark. I had finally severed the toxic ties that had bound me for 35 years. "You have until tomorrow evening to figure out how you are going to pay the bank. $450,000, I said, breaking the heavy silence. "I suggest you spend the next 24 hours finding a very good criminal defense attorney instead of harassing me at my home. Do not ever come to my house again." I turned my back on them, walked up my front pathway, and unlocked my door. I stepped inside my quiet, safe sanctuary and closed the heavy wooden door behind me, listening to the satisfying click of the deadbolt sliding into place. The 24-hour countdown was officially in its final stage. Tomorrow was Thanksgiving Day, and the table was finally set for the ultimate collapse. I woke up at exactly 6 o'clock on Thursday morning. For the first time in my 35 years of life, my home was completely silent on Thanksgiving Day. There was no loud gospel music blaring from a kitchen radio. There was no overwhelming aroma of sweet potato pies baking in the oven, or the rich smell of a massive turkey roasting for hours. There were no frantic phone calls from aunts and cousins asking for directions or debating who was bringing the macaroni and cheese. The holiday that had defined my family for generations, the sacred day we supposedly set aside to honor our ancestors and our blessings, had been entirely erased. In its place was a cold, clinical quiet that settled over my downtown condo like a heavy blanket. I did not feel sad. I did not feel any of the heavy, crushing guilt my parents had tried so desperately to project onto me the night before. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of focus. I got out of bed and walked into my bathroom. I did not pull out a comfortable matching holiday sweater or a nice dress for church. Instead, I reached into the back of my closet and pulled out my sharpest, most intimidating piece of corporate armor. It was a tailored charcoal gray power suit with an immaculate white silk blouse. I pinned my hair back, perfectly smoothing every single strand into place. I applied my makeup with military precision, making sure my expression was entirely unreadable. Today was not a holiday. Today was an execution. The drive through downtown Atlanta was surreal. The city streets were completely deserted. The usual chaotic gridlock of commuter traffic was gone, replaced by empty intersections and quiet sidewalks. Everyone else in the city was safely tucked away inside their warm homes, surrounded by the people they loved, preparing to give thanks. I was driving toward a massive glass and steel high-rise building to officially dismantle the people who shared my last name. I pulled my car into the underground parking garage of the downtown mediation center. The facility operated a specialized emergency clinic for high-stakes financial disputes and emergency foreclosures. Because the bank had initiated a high-risk terminal default protocol, this was the absolute last legal checkpoint before the property was formally seized and locked down by the county sheriff. I rode the empty elevator up to the 14th floor. The doors slid open with a soft digital chime, revealing a reception area that looked exactly like the inside of a hospital waiting room. The walls were painted a sterile, depressing shade of pale gray. The lighting was harsh fluorescent white, casting long, uncomplimentary shadows across the floor. It was the absolute antithesis of Big Mama's house. My grandmother's home was filled with warm mahogany wood plush, colorful rugs, and decades of vibrant family history. This place was entirely stripped of humanity. It was a place where ledgers were balanced and lives were legally ruined. A bored security guard sat behind a massive curved desk, tapping mindlessly on his phone. He pointed me down a long hallway, lined with heavily frosted glass walls. I walked slowly, my low heels clicking rhythmically against the polished concrete floor. As I approached Conference Room B, the frosted glass gave way to a clear, transparent pane. I stopped walking for a brief moment and stood in the hallway, silently observing the scene unfolding inside the room. My family had already arrived. The united front of arrogance and entitlement that had cornered me in my driveway just 12 hours ago was entirely gone. They looked like prisoners of war waiting for a military tribunal to begin. Vivian. My mother sat slumped in one of the heavy black leather chairs. I barely recognized her. My mother was a woman who never left her house without her signature pearl necklace, a perfectly pressed dress, and a flawless face of makeup. She was deeply obsessed with portraying the image of a wealthy, successful church matriarch. Today, she was wearing a plain, dark, oversized sweater that swallowed her frame. She wore absolutely no jewelry. Her face was completely bare, revealing the deep lines of exhaustion and stress etched around her mouth. Her eyes were swollen and red from crying all night. She looked like she had aged 10 years since the sun went down. Reginald, my father, sat directly across from her. The booming, imposing patriarch who had tried to physically trap me against my car was completely deflated. He was wearing the same suit trousers from the night before, but his jacket and tie were missing. He sat leaning forward with his elbows resting heavily on the smooth glass table, his face buried entirely in his hands. The most striking detail of the room, however, was the seating arrangement between Reginald and his golden child. For her entire life, Chloe had been the absolute center of my father's universe. They were always a united team, operating against me. But today, the dynamic was violently fractured. Chloe sat at the far end of the table, staring blankly at the wall. Reginald positioned his chair so that his back was turned slightly away from her. He refused to even look in her direction. The revelation of the forged bank documents had fundamentally broken the trust between them. The golden child had finally been exposed as a liability, and Reginald simply could not bear to look at the daughter who had stolen his mother's legacy to fund a lie. And then there was Trent. My white brother-in-law, the brilliant entrepreneur who was supposed to elevate our family name, was sitting a full 3 chairs away from his wife. The physical distance between Chloe and Trent was a glaring neon sign of his absolute betrayal. Facing the terrifying reality of federal wire fraud charges, Trent had immediately prioritized his own survival. He was not holding her hand. He was not whispering words of comfort. He sat rigidly in his chair, nervously bouncing his knee, looking like a cornered animal calculating its best route of escape. I took a deep breath, reached out and pulled the heavy metal handle of the conference room door. The door swung open, and the rhythmic clicking of my heels echoed loudly in the sterile space. 4 heads snapped up to look at me simultaneously. Nobody spoke. Nobody yelled. Nobody tried to play the victim or hurl an insult. The silence in the room was absolutely deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating silence born from total, complete defeat. They watched me with wide, fearful eyes, as if a complete stranger had just walked into the room. I did not offer a greeting. I did not acknowledge their pathetic state. I walked past Trent. I walked past Chloe. I walked past my mother and my father. I walked all the way to the very end of the long glass table. I pulled out the massive high-backed leather chair positioned exactly at the head of the table. In our family, the head of the table was a highly sacred position. It was the seat of power, the seat of authority, and the seat Reginald always claimed for himself during every single Thanksgiving dinner. I sat down in that chair, smoothed the front of my tailored suit jacket, and folded my hands neatly on top of my leather briefcase. I looked down the length of the table at the people who had treated me like a disposable emergency fund for 3 decades. The power dynamic had officially and permanently shifted. They were no longer the authority figures in my life. They were entirely at my mercy. I sat perfectly composed, waiting for the mediator to enter the room and deliver the final crushing blow to their perfect suburban illusion. Exactly 3 minutes after I took my seat at the head of the table, the heavy glass door of the conference room swung open again. The mediator walked into the room carrying a massive stack of manila folders. He was a stern, older black man, a retired county judge who carried himself with the absolute no-nonsense authority of someone who had spent decades dealing with liars and frauds. He wore a crisp, dark suit and a pair of thick reading glasses resting near the tip of his nose. He did not offer a warm smile. He did not wish anyone a happy Thanksgiving. He simply walked to the opposite end of the long mahogany table, sat down directly facing me, and dropped the heavy files onto the glass surface with a loud, authoritative thud. The sound made my mother physically jump in her seat. The mediator opened the top folder, uncapped his expensive fountain pen, and looked around the room, analyzing every single person at the table. His eyes lingered briefly on Trent and Chloe before settling on my father. "Let us skip the pleasantries and get straight to the legal reality of why we are sitting in this building on a federal holiday," the mediator began. His voice was deep, gravelly, and completely devoid of any sympathy. "I have spent the last 3 hours reviewing the emergency filings from the bank, the trust documents provided by Maya, and the secondary loan applications connected to the property in question. What we have here is a catastrophic financial failure wrapped in a highly criminal offense." Reginald opened his mouth, attempting to use his deep voice to take control of the narrative. "Now listen here, Your Honor." My father started trying to sound like the confident patriarch he was yesterday. "This is just a massive family misunderstanding. My daughter overreacted to a personal dispute, and we just need the bank to reinstate her guarantor status so we can go home." The mediator did not even look up from his papers. He simply raised his hand, silencing my father instantly. "You do not have the floor," Reginald, the mediator, said sharply, "and you are in absolutely no position to dictate terms to anyone in this room. You are not dealing with a family dispute. You are dealing with a corporate banking institution that is currently bleeding capital because of your negligence. Keep your mouth closed and listen very carefully to the facts I am about to lay out." Reginald snapped his mouth shut. His jaw clenched tightly, but he shrank back into his leather chair, entirely stripped of his power. It was the very first time in my life I had ever seen a man put my father in his place and command his absolute silence. The mediator adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Trent and Chloe. He pulled a specific piece of paper from the file and slid it to the center of the table. It was a blown-up copy of the forged signature on the secondary line of credit. The primary reason the bank accelerated this foreclosure from a standard 30-day notice to an immediate emergency seizure is because their fraud department flagged this specific document, the mediator explained. He tapped his pen against the paper. When Maya officially withdrew her financial backing, the bank ran an automated compliance check on all associated lines of credit. They discovered that the signature on the secondary loan application does not match any of Reginald's historical banking records. Trent shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face turning pale and sweaty. Chloe stared down at her lap, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. "The bank knows this signature was forged," the mediator continued, his voice growing colder. "They also tracked the IP address of the computer where the digital transfer was initiated, and they tracked the destination of the stolen funds. It went directly into a business account registered to Trent." Let me be perfectly clear with both of you. Forging a signature to extract equity from a federally backed mortgage is not a simple mistake. It is federal wire fraud. It carries a mandatory minimum sentence, and the bank is fully prepared to hand this file over to the district attorney by 5 o'clock today. A sharp gasp escaped my mother's lips. She grabbed a tissue from her purse and pressed it against her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute terror. Vivian was finally understanding that her golden child was not just spoiled, but a liability who was about to go to federal prison. The mediator let the threat of prison hang in the air for a long, heavy moment before pivoting his attention back to the immediate crisis of the house. Now let us address the property itself, the mediator said, closing the folder. The primary guarantor has legally and rightfully withdrawn her backing due to a breach of trust. The bank has declared the $450,000 mortgage in terminal default. Because of the fraudulent activity on the secondary accounts, the bank has absolutely zero interest in negotiating a payment plan or extending the deadline. They want their money today. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He looked directly at Reginald and Vivian, delivering the ultimate unvarnished truth. There are only two possible scenarios that prevent the county sheriff from arriving at your house tomorrow morning to change the locks and physically remove your belongings, the mediator stated. Option 1 requires you, Reginald, to purchase the property back at its current market value. Because of the default, the bank will not accept the original loan amount. They are demanding the full market value of the estate to clear the fraudulent liens. That means you need to produce a cashier's check for exactly $820,000 before the close of business today. Reginald's shoulders completely collapsed. He let out a shaky breath, staring blankly at the polished wood of the table. "We do not have it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We do not even have $5,000. The accounts are completely frozen." The mediator did not show a single ounce of pity. He simply nodded and moved straight to the final alternative. "Since you cannot execute option 1, that leaves us with option 2, the mediator said, turning his gaze directly down the table toward me. Option 2 is a unilateral assumption of the property. Maya, as the primary guarantor with the verified capital, can execute a hostile takeover of the deed. She can pay off the original $450,000 balance in cash today, completely bypassing the market value penalty. The bank gets their money and they drop the immediate foreclosure proceedings. The mediator paused, taking off his reading glasses and placing them neatly on top of his folders. However, he continued, addressing my parents. This means the private trust is completely dissolved. Reginald and Vivian, you will be legally stripped of any and all ownership rights. Maya will assume 100% unilateral control of the property. It will belong entirely to her, and as the sole legal owner, her very first action has already been drafted and submitted to this office. The mediator slid a single crisp white document toward the center of the table. If Maya pays off this house today, she will immediately execute a mass eviction notice, the mediator stated cleanly. Every single person currently residing in that house will be legally required to vacate the premises within 30 days. The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. The reality of their situation had finally hit them with the force of a freight train. They had spent decades treating me like I was entirely disposable. They had mocked my career, drained my savings, and uninvited me from the family table simply because I refused to fund their fake lifestyle. And now, sitting in this cold, sterile room, they realized that their entire existence rested completely in the palm of my hand. I held all the money, I held all the leverage, and I was staring right back at them with absolutely no intention of backing down. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint rhythmic hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing above us. The heavy reality of the mediator's words hung in the air, pressing down on my family like a physical weight. Trent was the very first person to break under that pressure. He was a man who had spent his entire life failing upward, entirely cushioned by his unearned confidence and his inherent privilege. He had never faced a single real consequence for his terrible business decisions, because my father had always been there to quietly write a check and sweep the mess under the rug. But looking at the stern, uncompromising face of a retired judge threatening him with a federal wire fraud indictment, the grand illusion of Trent's invincibility completely shattered. The survival instinct of a desperate coward is a very ugly thing to witness in real time. Trent abruptly pushed his heavy leather chair back. The metal legs scraped harshly against the polished concrete floor, echoing like a gunshot in the tense, silent room. He stood up, but he did not look at my parents. He certainly did not look at me. He turned his body completely away from his wife, creating a sudden glaring physical distance between them, and locked his eyes directly onto the mediator. "I want to go on the official record right now," Trent announced. His voice was trembling slightly, but it was loud enough to command the attention of the entire room. "I had absolutely nothing to do with orchestrating that secondary loan against the property. The forgery was entirely Chloe's idea." Chloe whipped her head around so fast, I genuinely thought her neck might snap. Her tear-stained face twisted into an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. "Trent, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice barely squeaking out of her tightened throat. "I am telling the absolute truth, Chloe," he snapped back, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at her face. He was throwing his beloved wife to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. "You told me your father gave us explicit permission to pull the equity from that house. You told me to sign the paperwork because you were too busy planning that extravagant vacation to the Bahamas. I only took that money because you never stopped complaining about how we needed to maintain a certain luxury lifestyle to impress your country club friends. You forced me into this massive financial hole just to protect your precious image." The absolute audacity of his lie hung heavy in the cold air. We all knew the truth. We all knew Trent had used that stolen money to purchase a luxury sports car to fund his massive offshore sports gambling habit and to pay for a mistress in Miami. But Trent did not care about the truth right now. He only cared about establishing plausible deniability to avoid a federal prison cell. He turned his back on Chloe completely and leaned over the glass table toward the mediator. "I am a victim of extreme financial abuse," Trent declared loudly, puffing out his chest in a pathetic attempt to regain his corporate authority. "My wife manipulated my business accounts to hide her stolen money. I will not go to federal prison for a spoiled, entitled woman who cannot control her reckless spending habits. In fact, I am officially announcing right here and now in front of witnesses that I am filing for divorce immediately. I have already drafted an email to my attorney. I will be seeking full physical and legal custody of our children to protect them from their mother's criminal behavior. I want absolutely nothing to do with this family ever again." For exactly 2 seconds, the conference room was completely frozen in time. Then the golden child violently snapped. Chloe let out a sound that I had never heard a human being make before. It was a guttural, blood-curdling scream that sounded exactly like a wounded animal. The delicate weeping victim routine she had perfected over 3 decades completely evaporated. She lunged across the empty space between their chairs, throwing her entire body weight directly at her husband. "You lying coward!" she shrieked, her manicured hands curling into tight fists as she crashed heavily into his chest. "You stole my father's money to sleep with a cheap woman in a hotel, and now you are trying to take my children away from me. I will kill you, Trent. I will absolutely kill you." She swung her fists wildly, hitting his shoulders, his chest, and the side of his face. Trent stumbled backward, caught completely off guard by her sheer ferocity. His calves hit the edge of his heavy leather chair, knocking it completely over. It hit the floor with a massive, deafening crash. He raised his arms to protect his face, shoving her aggressively backward. He called her a crazy, unhinged criminal, yelling at her to back off and leave him alone. But Chloe did not stop. She scrambled forward, her oversized sweatshirt slipping off her shoulder, grabbing fistfuls of his expensive silk tie and yanking his head downward. Total chaos erupted inside the sterile glass-walled room. Vivian jumped up from her seat, screaming hysterically. She scrambled awkwardly around the massive mahogany table, trying desperately to wedge herself between her daughter and her son-in-law. "Stop it!" Vivian shrieked, grabbing Chloe's flailing arms and pulling with all her might. "Stop it right now! You are going to get yourself arrested for assault. Please, Chloe, let him go." The 2 women struggled fiercely against Trent, who was actively pushing both of them away with aggressive force. Vivian was sobbing uncontrollably, her face bright red and smeared with tears. She turned her head toward the other side of the table, crying out for the only man who had ever solved her problems. "Reginald, please." Vivian begged, her voice cracking with pure absolute terror. "Do something! Get up and stop them! Fix this, Reginald, please fix our family!" I shifted my gaze strictly away from the violent scuffle and looked directly at my father. Reginald had not moved a single inch. He remained seated in his chair, completely paralyzed. His large hands were still resting flat on the glass table. His eyes were wide open, but they were completely vacant. He was staring right through the fighting, right through his weeping wife, and right through his screaming golden child. He was watching the complete and total destruction of everything he had spent his entire life building. He had sacrificed his relationship with me, his responsible, hardworking daughter, to constantly fund the illusion of a perfect, wealthy family. He had protected Chloe's terrible manipulative behavior since she was a toddler, and he had blindly trusted a mediocre man simply because of his smooth-talking promises and his race. Now that exact illusion was violently tearing itself apart right in front of his eyes. There was no more money left to hide the ugly truth. There was no more social status left to protect. Reginald was utterly and completely broken by the monsters he had created, and he finally realized he possessed absolutely zero power to stop them. The mediator stood up quickly from his chair, clearly disgusted by the physical altercation unfolding in his professional space. He reached for the heavy desk phone to call building security and have them physically separated. I remained seated perfectly still at the head of the table. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer to help my mother pull my sister away. I simply folded my hands, resting them on my leather briefcase, and watched the toxic system that had abused me for 3 decades finally consume itself. The mediator reached for the heavy black receiver of the desk phone, ready to call building security, to physically drag my sister and brother-in-law out of the room. I finally moved. I raised my right hand slightly, signaling the retired judge to stop. "That will not be necessary, Your Honor," I said, my voice slicing cleanly through the chaotic screaming and the heavy breathing. "We are finishing this right now." I unclasped the brass locks of my leather briefcase. The sharp metallic click was surprisingly loud enough to make Chloe freeze with her hands still tangled in Trent's ruined silk tie. Everyone turned their attention back to the head of the table. I reached inside and pulled out a crisp white envelope. I opened the flap, extracted a single heavily watermarked piece of paper, and dropped it directly onto the center of the glass table. It was a certified cashier's check drawn directly from my primary financial institution. The amount, printed clearly in bold black ink, was exactly $450,000. "I am officially executing Option 2, I announced, looking directly at the mediator. "I am assuming 100% unilateral control of the property. The remaining mortgage balance is paid in full as of this exact moment. Big Mama's house will not go to the bank today, and it will certainly not be auctioned off to strangers." The fighting instantly ceased. Trent practically shoved Chloe off of him, stumbling backward as he stared greedily at the piece of paper that could save the house from immediate foreclosure. But he quickly realized the terrifying truth. Paying the bank satisfied the property debt, but it did not erase the forged signatures on the secondary loan. The bank was getting their money, but the district attorney was still getting his federal wire fraud file. Trent was still going to be indicted. Chloe wiped her running nose, staring at the check with wide, disbelieving eyes. My mother, Vivian, let out a massive, dramatic breath of relief, her shoulders dropping completely as she fell back into her leather chair. She actually smiled, a weak, pathetic little smile, thinking that her reliable scapegoat daughter had just caved to the intense pressure and saved the family from ruin once again. "Oh, Maya, thank God!" Vivian cried out, pressing a hand to her chest. "I knew you would not do this to us. I knew you would remember your family and do the right thing." I looked at my mother, feeling absolutely nothing but pity for her deep, endless delusion. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out a second stack of documents. This stack was much thicker, secured with a heavy black binder clip. I slid it firmly across the long glass table, stopping it directly in front of my father. "I did not do this for you, Vivian," I stated coldly, correcting her immediately. I did this to protect the legacy of the only person in this family who actually worked for what she had. Big Mama's house is safe, but the private trust is officially dissolved. As the mediator explained, I am now the sole legal and physical owner of the estate. You no longer own the roof over your head. I do. Reginald stared down at the thick document sitting in front of him. What is this? He asked, his voice sounding completely hollow and utterly defeated. That is an ironclad residential lease agreement, I explained, leaning back comfortably in my high-backed leather chair. Since you no longer hold the deed, you are now legally classified as tenants. The house is my private rental property. You and Vivian are welcome to stay in the home, but you will pay me market-rate rent on the first day of every single month. The rent is $4,200 a month. If your payment is late by even a single week, I will initiate formal eviction proceedings immediately, and I will have the county sheriff remove your belongings from the property. Vivian's weak smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. She looked at the massive lease document, and then looked up at me as if I had just grown a second head. $4,000, she gasped. Maya, we are on fixed pensions. We cannot afford to pay that kind of rent every single month. Then I highly suggest you start aggressively downsizing your lifestyle, I replied smoothly. You can stop buying expensive designer clothes for church, and you can stop funding your golden child's extravagant vacations. Your financial mismanagement is no longer my problem to solve. You will pay me on the first of the month, or you will pack your bags. But I was not finished. The ultimate catch, the most important clause of the entire lease, was sitting right on page 3. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the document. Turn to page 3, Reginald, I commanded. Read clause 7 aloud for the entire room to hear. My father flipped those heavy pages with trembling hands. He found the specific clause highlighted in bright yellow ink. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat before he read the words in a quiet, broken whisper. Clause 7 tenant agrees that under no circumstances shall Chloe and Trent be permitted on the premises. Any violation of this physical ban will result in immediate termination of the lease, and the aforementioned individuals will be prosecuted for criminal trespassing. Chloe let out another sharp, wounded gasp. She stepped toward the table, her eyes darting frantically between me and our father. You cannot do that, she protested, her voice trembling with fresh panic. That is my childhood home. You cannot ban me from my own house. Where are the kids, and I supposed to go for the holidays? You can go anywhere you want, Chloe, I said, my voice radiating absolute zero warmth. But you will never step foot on my property, ever again. You forged documents to steal my grandmother's legacy. You are a massive financial liability and a proven criminal. You are permanently exiled from that house. If I see your vehicle parked in that driveway, or if my security cameras catch you walking up those front steps, I will have the police arrest you in front of your children without a second thought. I looked back at my father, who was still staring blindly down at the highlighted text. His beloved golden child was officially banished from the family estate. He could not host his lavish Thanksgiving dinners with her anymore. He could not show off his perfect white son-in-law to his golf buddies. The entire foundation of his arrogant existence had been legally and methodically ripped away from him. He had absolutely nothing left to bargain with and nowhere left to run. Sign the lease, Reginald, I instructed, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or debate. You sign the paper right now, or I instruct the mediator to file the immediate eviction notice, and you sleep in your car tonight. Reginald's hands were shaking violently. He looked like a man standing at the gallows. He reached into his pocket and slowly pulled out his expensive gold fountain pen. He uncapped it, his fingers trembling so badly he could barely grip the metal barrel. Vivian leaned forward, her eyes wide with disbelief and absolute horror. She looked at her husband, who was entirely broken, and then looked across the long glass table directly into my eyes. She simply could not fathom that the daughter she had controlled, ignored, and manipulated for 35 years was actually executing this incredible level of supreme authority. Maya, she whispered, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of her shattered reality. Are you really going to make your own parents pay you rent? I looked Vivian dead in the eye and felt absolutely no hesitation as I delivered the final unvarnished truth. "You are not paying your daughter Vivian," I replied, my voice completely flat and unwavering. "You are paying your landlord. Thanksgiving is cancelled, remember." My mother physically recoiled as if I had slapped her across the face. She opened her mouth to argue, to beg to use one last desperate emotional manipulation, but no words came out. The absolute finality in my tone suffocated whatever defense she had left. She slumped back into her heavy leather chair, burying her face in her hands, and began to weep silently. It was not the loud theatrical crying she had performed in the driveway the night before. It was the quiet, devastating weeping of a woman who had finally realized the absolute limits of her own manipulation. Reginald did not say a single word. He did not attempt to negotiate the rent down. He did not ask for a grace period. He slowly uncapped his gold fountain pen, his large hands trembling so violently he could barely press the nib to the paper. He signed his name on the bottom of the lease agreement and initialed every single page, acknowledging that he had officially lost his absolute authority. He had lost his pride, he had lost his golden child, and he had permanently lost his power over me. The mediator silently collected the signed documents, stamped them with his official seal, and slid my copy across the glass table. I did not offer them a goodbye. I did not wish them a happy holiday. I simply picked up my copy of the ironclad lease, placed it neatly inside my leather briefcase, and fastened the brass locks. I stood up, smoothed the front of my tailored charcoal suit, and walked out of the conference room. I did not look back at Trent sweating in his chair, at Chloe staring blankly at the wall, or at my parents sitting in the ruins of their perfect suburban illusion. I walked down the long, quiet hallway, rode the elevator down to the parking garage, and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. As I drove my car out of the downtown financial district, the city felt entirely different. I was completely free. I had left them behind in the cold, harsh reality of their own choices. 6 months later, the dust had fully settled, and the absolute destruction of their toxic dynamic was a matter of public record. The consequences came swiftly and mercilessly, completely reshaping the landscape of my family. The bank did exactly what the mediator promised they would do. They handed the entire secondary loan file over to the district attorney. Trent was formally indicted on multiple federal charges of wire fraud and identity theft. His arrogant, privileged attitude completely evaporated the moment the federal marshals showed up at his luxury rented townhouse to place him in handcuffs. He tried to hire a high-powered defense attorney, but without my father writing the checks, he could only afford a basic public defender. The massive tech startup he had boasted about was completely liquidated to pay restitution, and he was currently awaiting trial while wearing an ankle monitor. He was looking at a mandatory minimum of 5 years in a federal penitentiary. Chloe experienced a financial collapse so severe it completely erased her carefully curated social media presence. When Trent threw her under the bus to save himself, their marriage imploded overnight. The divorce proceedings were incredibly messy and entirely public. Because she had actively participated in the forgery, she was also facing immense legal scrutiny. She managed to avoid federal prison by accepting a harsh plea deal that required her to complete hundreds of hours of community service and pay massive fines. Completely cut off from the family wealth that no longer existed, Chloe was forced to move out of her sprawling suburban estate. She was currently living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. For the first time in her 32 years of life, the golden child had to get a minimum wage administrative job just to keep her lights on. There were no more fake victim videos on Facebook. There were no more designer handbags or luxury vacations. She was living the exact life she used to mock me for surviving. As for my parents, Reginald and Vivian, they were still living quietly in Big Mama's sprawling brick house, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The grand estate was no longer a fortress of wealth and social status. It was a massive financial burden they could barely maintain. Every single month, on the first day of the month, a direct deposit of exactly $4,200 landed securely in my banking portal. In order to afford my market rate rent, Reginald had been forced to sell his luxury sedan and purchase a cheap used sedan. Vivian had to cancel her exclusive country club memberships and start shopping at discount grocery stores. The worst punishment for my parents, however, was the absolute loss of their social standing. When Trent's federal wire fraud indictment became public news, the entire church congregation found out the undeniable truth. The aunties and deacons who had sent me nasty text messages calling me a monster suddenly realized that my sister and brother-in-law had actively stolen my grandmother's equity. The public pity Vivian had desperately tried to harvest completely dried up instantly, replaced by vicious community gossip. My parents stopped attending Sunday service because they simply could not handle the judgmental whispers and the sideways glances. They were completely isolated, trapped inside a massive house they no longer owned, paying rent to the daughter they had thrown away. It is exactly 1 year later, and the crisp November air is blowing through the streets of Atlanta once again. It is Thanksgiving Day. But this year, my condo is not silent, and it is certainly not cold. The rich, incredible aroma of a massive roasting turkey, baked macaroni and cheese, collard greens, and sweet potato pies fills every single corner of my home. The air is vibrating with loud, joyful laughter and the smooth sounds of classic soul music playing through my surround sound speakers. I am hosting my very own Thanksgiving dinner. My long dining table is beautifully decorated with autumn centerpieces and tall, glowing candles. But the people sitting around this table do not share my bloodline. They are my chosen family. I am surrounded by my corporate mentors who have guided my career, close friends who have supported my mental health, and colleagues who respect and uplift me every single day. There is no tension in this room. There is no walking on eggshells trying to appease an arrogant patriarch or avoiding the manipulative tears of a golden child. There is only genuine, unconditional love. As I stand in my kitchen pouring a glass of expensive red wine, I take a moment to reflect on the massive journey of the past 12 months. In our community, we often talk about the black tax. It is the unspoken, heavy expectation that the successful child must endlessly fund the financial mistakes of their relatives simply because they share a last name. We are taught that loyalty means enduring financial abuse and that setting boundaries is a form of betrayal. But I learned the hardest way possible that biological ties do not grant anyone a license to drain your spirit or your bank account. Sometimes breaking generational curses requires you to stop playing the compliant victim. Sometimes protecting your peace and preserving your true legacy means you have to be perfectly willing to become the villain in a toxic family's story. I accepted that role, and it was the best investment I ever made. Just as I am about to carry the wine glasses to the dining table, my cell phone vibrates against the marble kitchen counter. The screen illuminates, cutting through the warm lighting of the room. I glance down at the caller identification. It says, Reginald. It is my father calling to wish me a happy holiday. Calling to see if the punishment is finally over. Calling to see if the door to my bank account might magically creak open just a little bit. I look at his name flashing on the screen. I do not feel angry. I do not feel a sudden rush of anxiety or a desperate need to answer and seek his approval. I simply feel nothing at all. I smile softly, reach out and swipe the screen, switching the phone completely to Do Not Disturb mode. I leave the phone face down on the cold marble counter. I pick up the tray of wine glasses, turn my back on the past, and walk happily toward my real family to carve the turkey. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you have ever had to draw a hard line in the sand and walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace, I want you to know that you are not alone and you are not the villain. Please let me know how you found your freedom in the comments below. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with anyone who needs the courage to cancel their own toxic traditions. Have a beautiful holiday, and remember that your peace is always worth the price of their disappointment.